They say that memory is a curse. For us humans, it serves as a theater of regret, allowing us to replay our traumas, our mistakes, and the moments where everything went wrong, over and over again, in the silence of our minds. We tend to believe we are unique in this suffering. We believe we are the only creatures on this earth capable of holding on to a grudge for a decade, or mourning a loss long after the grave has been filled by the earth. But we are wrong. We are so arrogant in our sorrow. There are eyes watching us from the high branches of the winter trees, eyes that shine like polished obsidian, eyes that record every single movement we make. They remember the face that offered a crust of bread in the dead of winter, and they remember, with terrifying clarity, the face that threw the stone. Tonight I am going to tell you a story about that specific kind of memory, a story about a bond that transcends the barrier of species, and a form of justice that does not require a judge, a jury, or a law book. It only requires patience. It requires the absolute silence of the night, and it requires a debt to be paid in full. But before we step into the shadows of this tale, I have a small personal favor to ask of you. Just a brief moment of connection between my voice and your heart. This channel, this sanctuary of stories we are building here together, it is a dream I have held close for a very long time. We are small right now. We are like a tiny flickering candle in a vast dark room. My goal, my humble wish, is to gather 1,000 souls here by the end of this year. 1,000 listeners who find comfort in the rain and the dark. If you feel the atmosphere of this story, if these words touch something inside you, please consider subscribing. It would be the greatest gift you could give me. Help us reach that milestone. Help us keep the fire burning so we can tell more stories like this one. Thank you. Now, take a deep breath. Listen to the sound of the rain against the window. Let the world fade away. The town of Blackwood was not a place where happy endings were manufactured. It was a gray, industrial scar on the landscape, surrounded by dense pine forests that seemed to swallow the light long before the sun had actually set. In the heart of this town, in a small weathered house at the end of a forgotten cul-de-sac, lived Elias Thorne. Elias was 72 years old, and for all intents and purposes, he was invisible. You know the type. The old man, in the coat that is slightly too big for his shrinking frame, buying a single loaf of bread and a tin of soup at the grocery store on Tuesdays. The man who walks with a slight limp, his eyes always downcast, apologizing to the air for taking up space. Elias had outlived his wife, Martha. He had outlived his friends, who had either moved away to warmer climates or moved on to the cemetery on the hill. He had even outlived his old dog, Buster. His world had shrunk down to the four walls of his living room, the smell of old paper and dust, and the small overgrown garden in the back that he no longer had the strength to tend. But Elias was not entirely alone. He had a visitor that arrived every morning at 6 a.m. sharp, tapping a black beak against the frosted glass of the kitchen window. He called him Midnight. Midnight was a raven, not a common crow, but a massive, sleek raven with feathers that shimmered with an iridescent purple and blue sheen when the weak morning light hit them. He was a creature of regal bearing, intelligent, cautious, and terrifyingly observant. He wasn't a pet. He didn't belong to Elias. He belonged to the wind, the storms, and the trees. But every morning, for 5 years, he came to Elias. It started with a piece of stale toast left on the porch railing during a particularly brutal blizzard 5 years ago. Elias had seen the black shape huddled against the cold, fluffing its feathers against the biting wind, and felt a pang of deep sympathy. "Here you go, little shadow," he had whispered, his breath clouding in the freezing air. The bird had watched him, head cocked to the side, calculating the risk. It didn't fly away. It waited until the door closed, then hopped down, snatched the bread, and vanished into the whiteout. The next day, the bird was there again, and the next. Over time, the ritual became the only thing anchoring Elias to the world of the living. He would wake up, his joints aching with arthritis, the silence of the empty house pressing in on his ears, and he would shuffle to the kitchen. He would cut up pieces of high-quality cheese, maybe a bit of boiled egg, sometimes unsalted peanuts he bought specifically for this purpose. He would open the window, and midnight would land on the sill with a heavy thud. They never touched. Elias never tried to pet him. He respected the wildness and the dignity of the creature. He would simply talk. He told the bird about Martha and how much he missed her cooking. He told him about the watchmaking shop he used to own downtown, about the delicate gears and springs that used to dance under his fingers before his hands started to shake. He told him about the loneliness that felt like cold water filling his lungs, rising a little higher every day. And midnight would listen, truly listen. His black bead-like eyes would lock onto Elias's face, unblinking. Sometimes, he would make a soft clicking sound in his throat, a guttural purr that Elias interpreted as agreement or comfort. Sometimes, he would bring gifts. That was the strangest part of their arrangement, the gifts. It started with a blue plastic bottle cap, then a shiny piece of copper wire, once a perfectly round, colorful glass marble. Midnight would leave these treasures on the sill in exchange for the food, nudging them forward with his beak. Elias kept them all in a small hand-carved wooden bowl on his kitchen table, a collection of worthless trinkets to the rest of the world, but to him, they meant more than gold bars. It was a transaction of love, a language spoken without words. "I see you," the gift said. "You are not invisible to me." But the world outside that garden was cruel. It was indifferent to the bond between an old man and a bird. And one rainy Tuesday, in November, the cruelty of the world came knocking on Elias's door. But it didn't knock with a hand, it knocked with a boot. The sound of wood splintering is a distinct visceral noise. It does not sound like a branch snapping in the wind, or a heavy book falling to the floor. It sounds like violence. It sounds like the sudden, irreversible breaking of safety. When the back door of Elias's kitchen gave way under the force of the boot, the noise seemed to reverberate, not just through the walls of the small house, but through the very bones of the old man sitting in the armchair. Elias froze. The book he was reading, a tattered paperback about the history of clocks, slipped from his trembling fingers and hit the rug with a soft thud that was swallowed instantly by the roaring of the wind outside. For a second, a single, agonizing second, his mind tried to rationalize the horror. Perhaps it was the storm, perhaps a tree branch had fallen, but then came the heavy, wet footsteps. Slap, slap, slap. The sound of mud and water being tracked onto the linoleum floor of the kitchen. The sound of heavy breathing. The sanctuary was breached. Elias tried to stand up. His instincts, dormant for decades, screamed at him to run, to hide, to find a weapon. But his body was 72 years old. His knees locked, stiff with fear and arthritis. By the time he managed to grip the armrests of his chair and hoist himself halfway up, the shadow was already looming in the doorway of the living room. The intruder was tall, a hulking silhouette against the dim light of the hallway. He wore a heavy dark green rain jacket that dripped water onto the carpet, creating a growing puddle of filth. His face was hidden behind a black ski mask, the kind that turned a human being into a faceless monster, stripping away any possibility of empathy. Only his eyes were visible, wide, darting, fueled by a dangerous cocktail of adrenaline and likely desperation. "Sit down," the intruder barked. His voice was jagged, harsh, like gravel grinding in a mixer. Elias collapsed back into the chair, the air leaving his lungs in a wheezing gasp. "I don't have much," Elias stammered, his hands raising involuntarily in a gesture of surrender. "Please, there is a tin box in the kitchen drawer, next to the sink. It has my pension money for the month. Take it, just take it, and go." The intruder laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound that chilled Elias more than the storm outside. "I'll take the money, old man, but I'm going to look for the rest too. People like you always hide the good stuff under the mattress, don't you? Gold, jewelry from the dead wife." He moved into the room, bringing the smell of stale tobacco, rain, and aggression with him. He was a whirlwind of destruction. He didn't just search, he destroyed. He swept the collection of porcelain figurines Martha had loved off the mantel, watching them shatter into 1,000 pieces with no more emotion than one would have watching rain hit the pavement. He pulled drawers out of the antique desk and dumped them upside down, scattering old letters and bills across the floor. Elias watched, tears blurring his vision. He wasn't crying for the objects, he was crying for the violation. Every item this man touched, he tainted. The safety of this home, built over 40 years of quiet living, was evaporating in minutes. "Please," Elias whispered, his voice cracking. "Those are just memories. They have no value to you." The intruder ignored him. He moved back into the kitchen, his heavy boots crunching on the debris he had created. Elias could hear him rummaging through the drawers, the clatter of silverware, the slam of cupboards, then silence, a long heavy silence. The intruder walked back into the living room. In his left hand, he held the wad of cash from the tin box, but it was what he held in his right hand that made Elias's heart stop cold in his chest. He was holding the wooden bowl, the bowl that Elias kept on the kitchen table, the bowl filled with midnight's gifts, the blue bottle caps, the twisted copper wire, the colorful marbles, the smooth river stones, and sitting on top of that pile of crow treasures, gleaming softly in the lamplight, was the silver pocket watch. It was an exquisite piece of machinery, sterling silver, engraved with a scene of a ship on the ocean, passed down from Elias's father and his father before him. It was the only thing of true monetary value Elias owned, but its worth to him was immeasurable. It was the object that had taught him to love time. It was the heart of his family history. The intruder picked up the watch, dangling it by its chain. He sneered at the bowl in his other hand. "What is this trash? You collecting garbage, old man? Bottle caps." He tilted the bowl, letting the items fall to the floor. Click, clack, roll. The marbles rolled under the sofa, the bottle caps scattered. The gifts from midnight were treated like refuse. "Stop," Elias cried out, a surge of desperate energy propelling him forward. He stood up, his legs shaking violently. "Take the money, keep the cash, but please, not the watch, and leave the bowl alone, please." The intruder looked at the watch, then at Elias. He saw the desperation in the old man's eyes. He saw the weakness, and like a predator sensing a wounded animal, he exploited it. "This must be worth a few hundred," the intruder muttered, weighing the silver in his palm. He looked at the scattering of crow gifts on the floor, and kicked a marble away with his boot. "And you're a crazy old bat, keeping trash on your table." "It's not trash," Elias said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and a strange defensive pride. "They are gifts." "Gifts?" the intruder scoffed. "From who?" "The garbage fairy." He turned to leave, stuffing the watch into the deep pocket of his green rain jacket. "No," Elias lunged. It was a pathetic, doomed attempt. He reached out, his thin papery hand grasping for the intruder's sleeve. He just wanted to stop him. He just wanted to beg one last time, but the intruder reacted with instinctual violence. He didn't just pull away, he shoved. He planted a heavy hand on Elias's chest and pushed with all his strength. Elias flew backward. He felt his feet leave the ground. Time seemed to slow down. He saw the ceiling fan spinning lazily. He saw the shadows dancing on the walls. He felt the air rushing past him, and then the impact. The back of Elias's head struck the solid oak corner of the fireplace mantel. There was a sickening, wet crack, a sound that had no place in a home. Elias crumpled to the floor, like a puppet whose strings had been cut.
Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded behind his eyes, followed immediately by a wave of cold, numbing darkness. He tried to speak, to say help, but his mouth wouldn't obey. His vision swam. The room tilted sideways. He could feel a warm liquid pooling rapidly around his head, soaking into the rug. The intruder stood over him, breathing hard. For a moment, the man froze. The reality of what he had done washed over him. He looked at his own hands, then at the old man bleeding on the floor. He didn't check for a pulse. He didn't call for help. Fear replaced the aggression. He scrambled backward, nearly tripping over the overturned chair. He turned and ran. He sprinted through the kitchen, his boots slipping on the linoleum, and burst out into the rainy night, leaving the door wide open. The house fell silent, save for the howling wind and the rhythmic sound of rain hitting the floorboards. Elias lay motionless. The world was fading to black, but outside, the darkness had eyes. High up in the old oak tree, sheltered from the worst of the gale, midnight had been watching. The raven had seen the light in the kitchen. He had seen the stranger enter. Through the window, he had watched the violence unfold like a silent film. He saw the old man fall. He saw the stranger flee. Ravens are not like other animals. They do not just react, they understand. Midnight tilted his head, his obsidian eyes locking onto the figure running through the rain, the figure in the green jacket. He memorized the gait. He memorized the shape. He memorized the scent of danger. Midnight did not call. He did not fly down to the window. Instead, he spread his massive black wings, pushing off the branch. He didn't fly towards the house. He flew after the man. The hunt had begun. The rain in Blackwood did not cleanse. It drowned. It turned the unpaved alleyways into sucking mud and slicked the cobblestones of the main streets with a treacherous, oily sheen. The intruder, whose name was unknown to the records of the town, but whose desperation was etched into every line of his face, ran until his lungs burned. He sprinted away from the small house at the end of the cul-de-sac, his boots slamming against the wet pavement, the stolen silver watch heavy and cold in his pocket. He was fueled by a frantic energy, the kind that comes only after crossing a line from which there is no return. He hadn't meant to hurt the old man. That was what he told himself as the wind whipped against his face. It was an accident, a shove, just a shove. He needed to get away, to disappear into the labyrinth of the industrial district where the streetlights were broken and the shadows were deep enough to hide a sinner. He reached the corner of 4th and Elm, a desolate intersection marked by a flickering neon sign of a closed liquor store. He stopped, doubling over, hands on his knees, gasping for air. His breath bloomed in white clouds before him, mixing with the relentless downpour. He looked back the way he had come. Nothing but darkness and rain. No sirens, no flashing lights, not yet. He let out a shaky laugh, a sound that was half sob. He was safe. He had the money. He had the watch. He just needed to get to the pawn shop on the other side of town in the morning, or maybe sell it to the fence at the rail yard. He straightened up, wiping the rain from his eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the watch again. Even in the gloom, the silver seemed to catch the faint ambient light. It was old money, real craftsmanship. He rubbed his thumb over the engraving of the ship, feeling the texture of the metal. Stupid old man, he muttered, trying to harden his heart, trying to bury the image of Elias lying on the floor. Should have just given it up. He pocketed the watch and turned to keep moving. But as he turned, he felt it. It is a primal instinct, buried deep in the reptilian part of the human brain, a leftover survival mechanism from a time when we were not the top of the food chain. The sensation of being watched, the prickling on the back of the neck, the sudden coldness between the shoulder blades. He spun around, scanning the rooftops and the telephone wires. At first, he saw nothing but the jagged silhouettes of chimneys and wet slate. But then, movement caught his eye. High above, perched on the metal arm of a street lamp that had long since burned out, sat a shape. It was blacker than the night around it, a silhouette carved from the void. It wasn't moving. It wasn't seeking shelter from the storm like a normal bird. It was sitting perfectly still, facing him. The intruder squinted. "A crow," he whispered. The bird shifted. It was large, too large for a common crow. Its feathers were soaked, but unruffled. It leaned forward, and for a split second, the man thought he saw a glint of amber light reflect in its eye. It was just a bird. Animals didn't care about human crimes. They didn't witness. They didn't judge. "Shoo," the man hissed, waving his arm aggressively. "Get out of here." The raven did not flinch. It simply tilted its head to the left, a mechanical, inquisitive motion. It was studying him. It was memorizing the green jacket, the height, the way he favored his left leg when he stood. Unnerved, the man picked up a loose stone from the gutter and hurled it upwards. The stone sailed through the air, missing the bird by a wide margin and clattering against the metal pole. Usually, a bird would scatter in a panic of flapping wings, but Midnight simply hopped, a single, efficient hop to the side, dodging the trajectory of the threat with casual ease. He didn't take flight. He didn't make a sound. He just resettled his wings and continued to stare. "Freak," the man muttered, shivering. The encounter had soured his relief. He pulled his collar up and began to walk again. Faster this time. He headed towards the east side, towards the dilapidated apartment complex known as the Stacks. He walked for 20 minutes, weaving through back alleys to avoid the main roads. He checked over his shoulder every few blocks. He was paranoid about the police, about a patrol car turning the corner. But he wasn't looking up. He didn't see the shadow gliding silently above him, hopping from roof edge to roof edge, gliding across the gaps with effortless grace. Midnight was a master of the wind. He used the updrafts from the buildings to conserve energy. He kept his distance, staying just out of the direct line of sight, but never losing the target. The scent of the man, the stale tobacco, the fierce sweat, the metallic tang of the old man's blood that might have been on his clothes, was a beacon to the raven's keen senses. This was not a hunt for food. This was something new. In the wild, ravens would follow wolves to a carcass, waiting for their share. They understood cause and effect. They understood that following the predator led to a result. But tonight, Midnight was following the predator not to share in the kill, but to mark him. The intruder finally reached the Stacks. It was a grim collection of brick buildings that smelled of mildew and despair. He punched the code into the rusted security gate and slipped inside the courtyard. He climbed the external metal staircase to the 3rd floor, his boots clanging softly on the grate. He reached apartment 304. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking, and finally unlocked the door. He slipped inside and slammed it shut, throwing the deadbolt safe. He leaned his back against the door, sliding down until he hit the floor. He closed his eyes, listening to the pounding of his own heart. He was safe. The old man couldn't identify him with the mask on. No one had seen him enter or leave. The rain had washed away his tracks. He stood up and walked to the small, grimy window that looked out over the courtyard. He peered through the blinds just to be sure. The courtyard was empty. The rain lashed against the asphalt. Paranoid, he whispered to himself. "You're just paranoid." He turned away from the window, pulling the curtains shut. He went to the small kitchen, opened a beer, and sat on his sagging sofa to inspect his loot properly. But outside, 3 stories up, on the railing of the balcony, directly opposite apartment 304, Midnight landed. The raven shook the water from his wings. He looked at the closed window. He looked at the faint light seeping through the crack in the curtains. He could hear the muffled sounds inside. The pop of a can opening, the creak of a sofa. Midnight did not leave. The wind howled around the building, threatening to blow him off his perch, but he gripped the railing with iron talons. He waited, he watched, and then he began to work. Ravens are mimics. They can imitate the call of a wolf to draw the pack to a carcass. They can imitate the sound of a fox. Some Those who have spent enough time around humans can imitate sounds that are far more unnatural. Midnight hopped closer to the window. He took a breath, expanding his chest, and then he let out a sound. It wasn't a croak. It was a sharp, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap. Inside the apartment, the intruder froze with the beer halfway to his mouth. He looked at the door. No, the sound hadn't come from the door. It came from the window. He waited. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded exactly like a knuckle rapping against the glass. "Who's there?" the man called out, his voice trembling. He stood up, grabbing a kitchen knife from the counter. He crept towards the window. He knew he was on the 3rd floor. It was impossible for someone to be knocking on the window unless they were on the balcony, and the only way to the balcony was through the apartment or a fire escape that was rusted shut. He reached the curtains and yanked them open. Nothing, just the wet railing and the night sky. He pressed his face against the glass, looking left and right. There was no one there. "Wind," he said aloud. "It's just the wind knocking a branch against the wall." He let the curtain fall back into place. He turned around to go back to the sofa. Tap, tap, tap. Louder this time, deliberate. The man spun around, ripping the curtain back again. And this time, he saw it, sitting on the bottom ledge of the window frame, separated from him by only a thin pane of cheap glass, was the bird. The same black bird from the streetlight. Midnight stared directly into the man's eyes. The bird didn't look frightened. It looked expectant. It opened its beak and tapped the glass again, right in front of the man's face.
The intruder stumbled back, dropping the knife. What the hell? He had heard stories of bad omens. He wasn't a superstitious man, but the intensity of the bird's gaze was unnerving. It felt personal. "Go away," he shouted, banging his fist on the glass from the inside. Midnight didn't move. He simply watched the man's fear. He watched the aggression, and he memorized the face behind the glass, now without the ski mask. He saw the scar on the chin. He saw the pale blue eyes. He saw the identity of the enemy. Having seen what he needed to see, Midnight let out a low, guttural croak, a sound that sounded almost like a laugh. He spread his wings and dropped from the ledge, disappearing into the darkness below. The man stood there, panting, staring into the empty night. He locked the window. Then he went to the front door and checked the lock again. He pushed a chair under the doorknob. He told himself it was just a bird, just a coincidence. But he didn't sleep that night. Every time the wind rattled the vents, every time a pipe creaked, his eyes darted to the window. He felt marked. Meanwhile, Elias Thorne lay in a hospital bed 5 miles away. A neighbor had noticed the open door and called 911. He was in a coma, the doctors said. Critical condition. The swelling in his brain was severe. But while Elias slept the sleep of the near-dead, his guardian was awake. Midnight did not return to the empty house that night. He stayed at the stacks. He roosted on the roof, directly above apartment 304. He was a beacon, and when the sun rose piercing the gray clouds of Blackwood, he would not be alone. The solitary witness was about to call the jury, because in the world of corvids, an injury to one who is loved is an injury to the flock, and the flock was coming. Morning in Blackwood arrived, not with a burst of sunlight, but with a gradual bruising lightening of the gray sky. The storm had passed, leaving behind a damp, heavy stillness that clung to the brickwork of the stacks. The air smelled of wet asphalt and ozone. Inside apartment 304, the intruder woke with a start. He had passed out on the sofa, the empty beer can tipped over on the floor. His neck was stiff, and a dull headache throbbed behind his eyes. For a moment, he forgot. He lay there, staring at the water stain on the ceiling, thinking it was just another hungover Tuesday. Then the memory of the night rushed back. The old man falling, the crack of the skull against the mantel, the flight in the rain, and the bird. He sat up quickly, his hand flying to his pocket. The silver watch was still there. He pulled it out. In the morning light filtering through the cheap blinds, it looked even more valuable. It was real. It was tangible. The bird, the tapping on the window, that was just a hallucination. A trick of the mind born from stress and exhaustion. Get a grip, he muttered to himself, rubbing his face. You're safe. You cash this in. You leave town for a few weeks. Simple. He stood up, stretched, and walked to the window. He wanted to prove to himself that the ledge was empty. He grabbed the cord of the blinds and yanked them up. He expected to see the empty courtyard. He expected to see a few puddles and the rusted dumpsters. He did not expect to see the audience. On the railing of the balcony across from him, there was not one bird. There were 5. They sat in a perfect row, like jurors in a box, facing his window. On the roof of the adjacent building, there were more. 10, 20, 50. The intruder blinked, stepping back. He looked down into the courtyard. The metal railings of the walkways were lined with them. The power lines that crisscrossed the complex sagged under the weight of black feathers. There were hundreds, crows and ravens, intermingled, a massive coalition of corvids that had descended upon the stacks like a plague, and they were silent. That was the most terrifying part. A gathering of this size should be a cacophony of caws and screeches, but they were absolutely silent. Every single head was turned towards apartment 304. Hundreds of obsidian eyes were fixed on him. What the fake? The intruder whispered, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead instantly. High above them all, on the highest peak of the roof, sat Midnight. He was the conductor of this silent orchestra. He had spent the night flying the perimeter, calling out with specific low-frequency guttural sounds that travel for miles. He had called the local murders of crows. He had called the solitary ravens from the forest edge. He had communicated a single primitive concept: threat, enemy. Here, the intruder backed away from the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. "It's a coincidence," he said aloud, his voice sounding thin and pathetic in the quiet room. "Just a migration or something." He grabbed his jacket, the green rain jacket. He needed to leave. He needed to get to his car and get to the pawn shop. Once he sold the watch and got the cash, he would drive west, get away from this creepy town. He checked the watch one last time, stuffed it into his jeans pocket to keep it safe, and grabbed his car keys. He unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the metal walkway of the 3rd floor. As soon as the door clicked shut behind him, the silence broke. It started with a single shriek from the roof, a piercing, angry cry that echoed off the brick walls. "Ta!" Then, the air exploded. As the intruder took his first step towards the stairs, the birds moved. They didn't just fly away, they swooped. A dozen crows dive-bombed from the gutter above him. They didn't make contact, but they came close enough that he felt the wind of their wings against his face. "Hey, get off," he shouted, ducking and waving his arms. He ran for the stairs. The noise was deafening now, a swirling vortex of black wings and screaming beaks. They were guiding him, herding him. Every time he tried to look up, a bird would swoop down, forcing him to keep his head low, forcing him to cower. He stumbled down the metal stairs, his boots clanging loudly, nearly slipping on the wet grate. He reached the ground floor courtyard. His car, a beat-up gray sedan, was parked near the gate. It was only 50 feet away. "Crazy birds," he yelled, sprinting for the car. But the flock had anticipated this. As he ran across the asphalt, the sky seemed to collapse on him. This wasn't just harassment anymore.
It was an assault. A raven, larger than the others, midnight, dropped from the sky like a stone, and raked his talons across the back of the intruder's head. The man screamed, stumbling forward as he felt the sharp scratch on his scalp. He fumbled with his keys, dropping them on the wet ground. He fell to his knees to grab them. As his hand reached for the keys, a crow landed on the pavement inches from his fingers, pecking aggressively at his hand. The man swatted it away, grabbed the keys, and scrambled to the car door. He threw himself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, locking it instantly. He was safe inside the metal box. He gasped for air, his chest heaving. He looked in the rearview mirror. He was bleeding. A thin trickle of blood ran down his neck where midnight had struck. "I'm killing every one of you," he hissed, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered and roared to life. He put the car in reverse, looking out the back window. The back window was black. He looked at the windshield. It was black. The birds hadn't left. They had landed on the car, hundreds of them. They covered the hood, the roof, the trunk. They clung to the side mirrors and the wipers. They were pecking at the glass, 1,000 beaks tapping rhythmically, angrily against the windows. Tap, 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 tap. It sounded like hail. It sounded like stones. The intruder honked the horn. The birds didn't move. They just screamed back, their caws drowning out the engine. "Get off," he screamed, slamming his hand on the dashboard. He shifted into drive and stomped on the gas. The car lurched forward. He couldn't see anything. The windshield was a wall of feathers. He turned on the windshield wipers. The blades swept back and forth, knocking a few crows off, but more took their place instantly. It was a nightmare of motion and noise. He tried to drive blindly towards the gate. He knew the layout of the parking lot. Straight ahead. Just go straight ahead. He accelerated. The car picked up speed. The birds held on, their talons scratching the paint, their bodies thudding against the metal. But in his panic, he miscalculated. He didn't see the heavy industrial dumpster that had been moved near the exit for collection day. Crash! The sedan slammed into the steel side of the dumpster at 20 miles per hour. It wasn't enough to kill him, but it was enough to deploy the airbag. Dust and white powder filled the cabin. The intruder was thrown back against the seat, dazed, his nose bleeding from the impact. The engine stalled and died. For a moment, there was silence inside the car. He coughed, waving the dust away. He tried to open the door, but the impact had buckled the fender, jamming the driver's side door shut. He was trapped, and outside the assault continued. The birds sensed the vulnerability. The tapping on the glass grew louder, more frantic. They knew he was in there, but now the spectacle had drawn attention. The noise of the crash, combined with the ungodly screaming of the flock, had woken the entire complex. People were stepping out onto their balconies. Residents were looking out their windows. "What is happening?" A woman yelled from the second floor. "Look at the car," a man shouted. "It's covered in them." Someone on the ground floor pulled out their phone. They started recording. A video of a gray car completely engulfed by a living shroud of black birds, crashing into a dumpster. It was the kind of thing you saw in a horror movie, not in Blackwood. "Call the police," someone yelled. "That guy is trapped in there." Sirens wailed in the distance. The police were already on their way, responding to multiple calls about a riot or disturbance at the stacks. Inside the car, the intruder was terrified. He wasn't scared of the police anymore. He was scared of the ancient primal force that was trying to get in. He curled up in the seat, covering his head with his arms. He felt the watch pressing against his leg in his pocket. It felt heavy. It felt cursed. The sirens grew louder. A patrol car screeched into the courtyard, lights flashing blue and red against the gray morning. 2 officers stepped out, hands on their holsters, looking up in disbelief. Holy Mother of Officer Miller muttered. He had been on the force for 20 years. He had never seen anything like this. The birds, seeing the new threat, began to disperse slightly. They lifted off the car in a great dark cloud, swirling above the courtyard like a tornado. But they didn't leave. They circled, but to 2007. Most of 2007 tours into Walcott. Midnight remained perched on the edge of the open dumpster, looking down at the wrecked car, screaming a warning. Officer Miller approached the vehicle, baton drawn. Driver, are you okay? Exit the vehicle. The intruder saw the police officer. Normally he would have hidden. He would have lied. But right now the police officer looked like a savior. Help me, the intruder screamed, kicking at the passenger door, which was still functional. Get them away from me. They're trying to kill me. He scrambled over the center console, falling out of the passenger door onto the wet asphalt. He crawled towards the police, looking up at the sky in terror. Help me. Put me in the car, please. Officer Miller grabbed the man by the arm, hoisting him up. Calm down, sir. Calm down. What is going on here? The birds, the intruder babbled, his eyes wide and manic. They followed me. Since the house, since I took the watch. They know. Officer Miller frowned. What house? What watch? The intruder froze. He realized what he had said. He clamped his mouth shut, his eyes darting from the officer to the circling birds above. Officer Miller wasn't a genius, but he was a cop. He looked at the man, the green rain jacket, the mud on the boots, the frantic behavior, and then he looked at the man's jeans. The pocket was torn slightly from the crawl across the asphalt. Dangling halfway out of the pocket, glinting in the flashing lights of the police cruiser, was a silver chain. Miller reached down. Sir, keep your hands where I can see them. The officer pulled the chain. The silver pocket watch slid out, even in the rain. It was clearly an antique, expensive, and on the back, which Miller flipped over, there was an engraving. To Elias Thorne, time is the only currency. Officer Miller's radio crackled. Dispatch to Unit 4. We have an update on that home invasion and assault from last night on Mulberry Street. Victim is Elias Thorne. Suspect described as wearing a green rain jacket. Miller looked at the jacket. He looked at the watch. He looked at the man. And then he looked up at the sky. The birds had stopped circling. They had landed on the roofs again. They were watching. Turn around, Miller said, his voice hard. You're under arrest. As the handcuffs clicked around the intruder's wrists, a single raven, Midnight, let out a satisfied croak from the dumpster. He watched as the man was shoved into the back of the patrol car. The debt was being collected, but the story wasn't over yet, because Elias was still fighting for his life, and Midnight had one last visit to make. The intensive care unit of St. Jude's Hospital was a world of white noise and fluorescent light. It was a sterile purgatory where time was measured, not by the ticking of a grandfather clock, but by the rhythmic electronic beep, beep of heart monitors. The air smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, a sharp, chemical scent designed to mask the smell of sickness. Elias Thorne lay in bed 4, surrounded by a fortress of machinery. Wires were taped to his thin bruised chest, an IV drip fed fluids into his arm. His head was wrapped in heavy bandages, a stark white contrast to the dark purple bruising that had spread down the side of his face. He looked smaller than ever, a fragile collection of bones beneath the hospital sheets. He had been unconscious for 36 hours. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about the swelling in his brain, but at his age, trauma was a thief that stole more than just health. It stole the will to keep going. Nurse Sarah Jenkins stood by the window of room 304, a strange coincidence of numbers that went unnoticed by everyone except the universe. She was adjusting the blinds, trying to block out the gray afternoon light so the patient could rest, but her hands paused on the plastic wand. She frowned, leaning closer to the glass. Dr. Arezes, she called out softly, keeping her voice low. The attending physician looked up from Elias's chart at the foot of the bed. Yes, Sarah, you need to see this, she said. It's the birds again. I've never seen anything like it. Dr. Ura sighed, rubbing his temples. The maintenance crew already called pest control. There's nothing we can do about pigeons. They aren't pigeons, Doctor, Sarah said, a tremor in her voice. Look. Dr. Areza walked to the window and peered out. St. Jude's was surrounded by a small park, a few decorative cherry trees and oaks meant to give patients a view of nature. But today the trees were not green or brown. They were black, hundreds of them. Every branch, every railing of the parking structure, every light post was occupied. A silent, unmoving army of crows and ravens. They weren't fighting over food. They weren't making noise. They were simply facing the building. Specifically, they seemed to be facing the third floor, facing room 304. That is unsettling, the doctor admitted, stepping back. It looks like a funeral procession. They've been there since Mr. Thorne was admitted, Sarah whispered. Security says they won't leave. They tried to scare them off with horns, but they just flew in a circle and came right back. Behind them the heart monitor picked up its pace slightly. Beep beep, beep beep. Elias stirred, his eyelids fluttered, heavy as lead curtains. A low groan escaped his throat. He's waking up, Sarah said, rushing to the bedside. Elias opened his eyes. The light hurt, the room spun. His memory was a fragmented puzzle. A storm, a crash, a green jacket, a pain like fire. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry as sandpaper. Water, he croaked. Sarah held a cup with a straw to his lips. He drank greedily. Mr. Thorne, Dr. Uris asked gently, shining a pen light into Elias's eyes. Can you hear me? Do you know where you are? Hospital, Elias whispered. He blinked, his vision clearing. Then panic seized him. His hand flew to his chest, fumbling with the hospital gown. The watch. He took the watch. Calm down, Elias, the doctor soothed. You're safe. You had a bad fall. Police are handling everything. My father's watch, Elias insisted, tears forming in his eyes. And midnight. Is the window open? I need to feed him. The doctor and nurse exchanged a worried glance. Brain damage, they thought. Confusion. Rest now, Dr. Areza said. There's an officer outside waiting to speak to you when you're ready. He has some news. Elias nodded weakly, sinking back into the pillows. The exhaustion was overwhelming. He closed his eyes, and the darkness took him again. But this time it was a natural sleep, not a coma. 2 hours later, the door opened. Officer Miller walked in. He looked tired. He was still wearing his rain-soaked uniform from the morning. He held a clear plastic evidence bag in his hand. He pulled a chair up to the bed. Elias was awake again, staring at the ceiling. Mr. Thorne, Miller said softly. Elias turned his head. Officer, I'm Officer Miller. I was the one who arrested the man who broke into your home. Elias let out a long breath he didn't know he was holding. You caught him. We did, Miller said. He hesitated. He was a rational man, a man of facts and reports. But what he had seen in that parking lot, the way the birds had swarmed that car, it defied his reports. He leaned in closer. Sir, I have to ask you something strange. Do you keep birds, or feed them? Elias managed a weak smile. I have a friend. His name is Midnight. Miller nodded slowly, the hairs on his arm standing up. A raven. Yes, a raven. Miller looked at the evidence bag in his hand. Then you should know. Your friend is very loyal. We found the suspect because his car was attacked by a flock. They trapped him until we got there. Elias's eyes widened. He looked towards the window, where the blinds were still drawn. He didn't just get caught, Miller continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. He was terrified. He gave this up immediately. Miller placed the plastic bag on the bedside table. Inside, untarnished and shining under the fluorescent lights, was the silver pocket watch. Elias reached out with a trembling hand. He touched the plastic. You found it. He had it in his pocket, Miller said. But the strange thing is, when we brought him into the station, the birds followed the cruiser. They sat on the roof of the precinct for an hour, until I booked the evidence. Then when I signed the watch out to bring it here to you, they left. They flew here. Miller stood up and walked to the window. He pulled up the blinds. Look, Elias strained to lift his head. Through the glass he saw them, the black trees, the army of shadows, and there standing on the narrow outer ledge of the windowsill, separated only by the glass, was Midnight. The raven looked different than usual. His feathers were ruffled, and he looked tired, but his gaze was intense. He looked at Elias, at the bandages, the tubes, the bruises. He tapped the glass gently. 1, 2, 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't a demand for food. It was a check-in. Are you alive? Elias smiled, tears streaming down his face freely now. Hello, old friend, he whispered. I'm okay. I'm okay. He looked at Officer Miller. Can you open it? Just a crack, sir. Hospital policy. Miller started, but he looked at the old man, and he looked at the bird. He saw something in that exchange that felt holy. Screw policy. Miller unlocked the window and slid it open 3 inches. A cool breeze rushed into the sterile room, carrying the scent of pine and rain. Midnight hopped closer. He didn't enter the room. He knew the boundary. He simply stretched his neck forward. Elias reached into the plastic bag Miller had opened. He pulled out the silver watch. He held it up so the bird could see it. The silver caught the light. You got it back, Elias whispered to the bird. Thank you. Midnight let out a soft purring croak, the sound he made when he was content. He looked at the watch, then at Elias. He bobbed his head once, a gesture of respect. Then with a powerful thrust of his wings, he pushed off the ledge. Caw! The cry was loud and triumphant, as if on command. The hundreds of birds in the trees took flight. The sky turned black with wings. The sound was like thunder, thousands of feathers beating the air at once. They swirled around the hospital tower, in a massive chaotic vortex of celebration, before breaking formation, and drifting back towards the forest, disappearing into the twilight. Officer Miller watched them go, speechless. I've never seen anything like that, he murmured. They were waiting for you to get the watch back. They were guarding it. Elias held the watch to his chest, feeling the cool metal warm up against his skin. They remember, Elias said softly, closing his eyes. We think we are the only ones who understand justice, officer, but we are wrong. They remember kindness, and they remember cruelty. The room fell silent again, but the sterility was gone. The air felt charged with something ancient. Elias Thorne would recover. It would be a long road. He would walk with a cane for the rest of his life, and the scar on his head would never fully fade. But he would return to the small house at the end of the cul-de-sac. He would fix the back door. He would sit in his armchair, and every morning at 6 a.m., the tapping would return. The intruder, a man named Gary Sipes, would plead guilty to all charges. He refused a lawyer. He refused bail. He told the judge he wanted to go to a cell with no windows. He told the court psychiatrist that he couldn't sleep at night, because every time he closed his eyes, he heard the sound of 1,000 wings. He lived in fear of the sky. But for Elias, the sky was no longer a void. It was a promise. As the sun set on St. Jude's Hospital, casting long shadows across the room, Elias wanted the silver watch. Click, click, the gears engaged. The heart of the machine began to beat again. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Order was restored. The debt was paid. And somewhere in the deep woods of Blackwood, high in the canopy of the oldest oak tree, a raven tucked his head under his wing, and slept, dreaming of silver, of rain, and of the man who had saved him from the cold. And so the curtain falls on the town of Blackwood. The rain has stopped, but the streets still glisten under the street lights, holding the reflection of a world where the line between man and beast is thinner than we dare to admit. The story of Elias and Midnight is not just a local legend. It is a reminder, a testament to a truth that science is only just beginning to catch up with. We treat the world around us as if it were a backdrop, a passive stage for our human dramas. We walk past the trees, we drive past the birds on the wires, assuming they are simple, instinct-driven machines. But as Elias learned, and as Gary Sipes learned with terrifying certainty, nature is watching. Corvids, ravens and crows are among the few creatures on this planet that possess what we call theory of mind. They understand that you have intentions. They understand that you have secrets. They can recognize a face for 5 years or more. But more importantly, they pass that knowledge down. The birds that swarmed the car outside the apartment complex were not all witnesses to the crime. Most of them had never seen the intruder before. They were acting on trust. They were acting on the word of midnight. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? When you walk through a park and toss a piece of bread to a bird, what are you buying? Are you simply feeding an animal? Or are you making a deposit in an ancient bank of karma? And conversely, when you act with cruelty, when you think no one is watching in the dark alleyways of your life, are you sure? Are you truly alone? Or is there an obsidian eye reflecting your image, storing it away for a day of reckoning? Elias Thorne is still there, in that small house. The wooden bowl is back on the table. It is full again, not with gold or diamonds, but with the currency of the wild. Bottle caps, colored glass, twisted wire. Each item is a contract renewed, a promise kept. He is no longer the invisible old man at the end of the cul-de-sac. He is the man who walks with the shadow. He is the man the flock protects. And perhaps that is the lesson we should take with us tonight, as we drift off to sleep. In a world that can be cold, industrial, and indifferent, loyalty can be found in the most unexpected places. You don't need to be powerful to be protected. You just need to be kind. Kindness, it turns out, is the only shield that truly works when the storm comes crashing down. My friends, we have reached the end of our journey for tonight. I hope the atmosphere of Blackwood reached you, wherever you are. I hope you could hear the rain and feel the wind. Writing and narrating these stories is a labor of love, a way to explore the darker, more beautiful corners of our imagination. As I mentioned at the start, this channel, The Obsidian Crow, is a dream in the making. We are building a flock of our own here, a community of people who appreciate the mystery, the silence and the story. If this tale moved you, if it gave you chills or made you look at the birds in your garden a little differently tomorrow morning, please leave a mark. Click that subscribe button. It is a small click for you, but for me it is the world. It brings us one step closer to that goal of 1,000 members in our flock before the year ends. And if you want to let me know you made it to the very end, that you are a true listener, leave a comment down below with just one word: midnight. Let the comment section be a tribute to the silent watchers in the trees. Thank you for lending me your ears and your time. Turn off the lights, check your windows, and remember, the eyes in the dark are not always enemies. Sometimes they are friends waiting for a crust of bread. Good night and sweet dreams.